Excellent. It's super funny because when I started doing research for this book, I actually went onto Quora and asked the question, what percentage of technological innovation and game-changing innovation actually owes to drug use and to LSD use? And so it's very exciting to see this question of subculture being reintroduced. And what I want to talk to you about today is essentially some of the weirdos that I've been hanging out with for the past 2 years. When we think of great innovators, we instantly go to the usual suspects. We think Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Steve Jobs. And in certain ways, I started getting the sense that we're all quite haunted by the ghosts of these dead white innovators. So, you know, when I'm in Starbucks, there's this assembly line process that's pushing me through. And, you know, when I wake up with my iPhone, I'm living in a world of Steve Jobs' creation. And I really wanted to get out of that box and begin to understand who else is innovating. What can we learn from a whole universe of innovators that aren't in Forbes, aren't in Fast Company, aren't on the pages of Harvard Business Review? And that's what I started to explore. Cue the video. Great, thank you. Thanks. So the point of this research that I undertook was to really begin to probe into the innovation practices that a lot of these different kinds of misfits were exploring. So to understand, you know, McDonald's didn't invent the franchise model. That actually goes back to the mafia, or the fact that a lot of the video streaming technology we take for granted now was utilized by the porn industry. And to help me illustrate what we can learn from misfits, I'm going to welcome on stage some characters that have been pretty inspirational in my life and talk a bit about, oh, thank you. Peace, yeah. Talk a little bit about what we can learn from each of them. Thanks guys, you look fantastic. Uh-oh, you look a little bit scary though. Wonderful. So let me go down and talk to this woman. So this is the Latin Kings logo. Yep. And so one of the first misfits that I had the opportunity to speak to was a man called King Tone. who actually ran the Latin Kings organization in New York, which is an underground street gang. And initially, I met him and I said, tell me about this gang, how does it work? And he stopped me at that sentence and said, don't call us a gang, call us an organization. And at the time that King Tone was running the Latin Kings, he had inherited leadership at a time when the gang was facing a lot of external scrutiny and regulatory pressure. And so his challenge was really to figure out, how do you pivot this gang? And so from misfits like Tone, I think you can see how we can learn a lot from the entrepreneurial skills, the hustle skills. There's actually a program that I met called Defy Ventures that takes ex-cons who are extraordinary charismatic leaders and connects them into an entrepreneurial incubator. So I'm just going to go over here now and see what you're up to. You look a little bit like a robber. Yeah, are you going to take my note card? Yeah, okay. Great. So in China and India, I ended up meeting with a lot of these patent robbers. And one thing that I learned was that you have a total disregard for IP, and hence maybe why you stole my note card. And so for me, it was really interesting to begin to understand how patent robbers are affecting mainstream industry. And specifically in India, I met a lot of these folks that were taking pharmaceutical drugs and reverse engineering them and then manufacturing them at much cheaper, more affordable prices. And so from this, the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, got really upset and obviously sued these patent robbers and tried to persecute them and tried to get government to crack down on them. But over time, they actually realized that wasn't an effective strategy. And so they had to learn from their enemies. They had to learn from their others. And that's one of the themes that's recurring throughout the misfit economy, is the ways in which the mainstream can actually learn from a lot of these fringe players. And so as a result, the pharmaceutical companies started exploring with tiered pricing for the first time. They actually had to develop more affordable drug prices, and they began experimenting with open innovation approaches to R&D. So rather than developing something in a really proprietary method, figuring out how they could work with other players to actually deliver more affordable drugs. So there's a lot that we can understand from patent robbers. I'm going to go over here now, because thank you for the hug earlier. That was really nice. Hippies. I recently met a hippie who lived on a commune in Vermont, and she said to me that she was making chai on a wood stove before Starbucks was serving chai tea lattes. And I just found her totally inspiring. She lived life in a completely different way. She lived on this commune. She arrived there pregnant. She found this makeshift family. And then 15 years later, she ended up marrying a senator. And so went from this hippie commune where she was totally naked during the day to being in Washington and having to be this buttoned-down wife of a politician. And so from her, we started having this conversation about what are some of the practices from the 60s. You know, if there was an audit from the 60s, what could we actually learn from that period? And I think a lot of my friends here who are up on stage, when they're not playing with their misfit alter egos, we're exploring this. We're looking at ways in which we can develop almost hippie 2.0 kinds of experiments. How do we co-live together? What are innovative approaches to love that don't end in total disaster? Are there alternatives to monogamy that don't induce all this emotional stress? So that's a bit of the conversation that we've been having with 60s counterculture. And I think someone's pretending to code over here, is that right? Or seriously, you're hacking into something maybe? Okay, you're not going to speak to me, that's okay. So from hackers, I mean, hackers potentially, that culture has, okay, he's continuing to rob people, that's great. Hackers have continually sort of been part of mainstream culture. Now hackathons are a normality. But one of the more interesting things that I've begun to appropriate from hacker culture in my own work is looking at more stealth and anonymized models of organization. So, for example, I was approached recently by folks that wanted to build out a network for women's leadership. And rather than do something with sort of big publicity, Davos-like World Economic Forum, we said, why don't we create this underground network? Why don't we actually study the anonymous brand and figure out what we can learn from this hacker collective to actually begin building out this organization? And so those are some of the experiments that in the last 2 years I've been co-opting from hackers, but this is certainly someone that we recognize very much as a hero today. This is one of my favorite characters, actually. I think you're meditating. Can I talk to you? It says don't talk to you. No, you don't want me to talk. Okay, I'm not going to talk to you, but I'll talk about you. And I think you're the Hermit. And the Hermit is one of the most endearing misfits to me. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just outside Walden Pond, which is where Henry Thoreau did his early experiments in transcendentalism, where he lived totally off the grid. And so as a little child, peeking into this cabin of this famous hermit, I just felt the extraordinary power that comes when you actually peel off from society, when you live in isolation and take yourself away from the dominant norms and logics that we all have to engage in mainstream society. And initially, I posed this question to a lot of my entrepreneurial friends. I was like, really, there's something that we must be able to learn from hermits. And a lot of them were like, no, the instincts of the entrepreneur are totally different from the hermit instincts. You have to be hustling, you have to be out there, you have to be going to conferences like this. And I said, well, wait a minute, what about entrepreneurs that actually aren't overly networked? What about entrepreneurs that are really saturated in their vision and take a long time to build something that's completely different, that is really challenging current worldviews? And I met an entrepreneur in San Francisco who built out something called New Hive, which is a platform to radically change self-expression. And this entrepreneur lived with his co-founders on an island outside of Seattle for an entire year, just incubating this platform. And then another entrepreneur I met was interested in the future of education. And so he holed himself up in rural France for 3 months and read everything there was to read about the future of education. So as much fun as conferences like this are, I think there's a huge role for isolation in innovation, and actually for internal processes, some of which we heard about earlier, the power of meditation, of Greenberg, things like that. And just the power of getting off the grid, I think, also allows you to engage in alternative realities. You're easily able to unplug, to begin to question the dominant dogmas of society, and really get into your own space. So thank you, Hermit, for being who you are and not talking to me. The protester, you look a little bit angry. You look a little bit agitated. Yep. So regardless of whether or not you thought Occupy was a good thing, I think Occupy actually poses some really interesting models. And initially, right after Occupy, I started having conversations with huge companies. And I said, what can we learn from the self-governance structures that Occupy really pioneered? How can we apply those within corporate contexts to create organizations that are much more functional? And someone mentioned to me, like, will CEOs become the new despots? Will people within companies want to overthrow their CEO in the same fashion that a lot of these protest movements have sought to overthrow leaders of companies? And really evolving out of this, we stumbled upon a guerrilla movement within companies, and we called this movement the League of Entrepreneurs. And these people were agitators within huge multinational companies. They worked in the likes of Shell or Exxon or GSK, and they were folks that weren't content with business as usual, who radically wanted to transform the DNA of these organizations. And the real problem that they had was figuring out how to drive change from within. I think the protesters' approach to change and their theory of change is very much driven from the outside. So what happens when you actually bring that protester into a multinational setting and say, how can you begin to hack the culture of this organization? So with the League of Entrepreneurs, we developed a toolkit for corporate change making and different practices that these folks can use to do sort of guerrilla hacking of their organizations. Great. Did I miss out on anyone? No. Okay. So spending 2 years with Misfits, I think we all have these moments. We did an amazing workshop yesterday on prototyping the self, where people explored their misfit instincts, their alter egos, and you have this experience where you go off somewhere, you have an incredible epiphany, and then you arrive back in normal reality, greeted by the machine. And so what are you meant to do? And I think even Henry Thoreau, who's one of the famous hermits and a good role model for me and very inspiring, after he left Walden, he went back and worked at a pencil factory, which is completely uninspiring. And so the question is, how do we actually create a safer space for these misfits within the economy? And this is how I've begun thinking about it. And certainly, this isn't something I'm doing alone, but I see many different people working on different pieces of the Misfit Revolution. And I think the point about subcultures is it all starts with identity. Initially, there needs to be a really strong identity proposition that is counter to mainstream culture. Even within the work we did with these corporate change makers, the League of Entrepreneurs, we branded them and we gave them an outsider identity so that they were empowered to not have to default into business as usual. And most social movements have this identity proposition. Most subcultures are built around alternative kinds of identities. And this is also very much connected to work on the self, of getting to know your own misfit instincts and how those might not exactly conform to societal's expectations of you. Next, looking at skills, so talking about the change-making skills that are required of misfits, even going back to the hustlers, and really recognizing that a lot of the misfits that we actually marginalize from society are really key and should be integrated in creative ways into the mainstream economy. And so with the hustlers, recognizing that actually there are a great set of entrepreneurial skills here. With spammers even, recognizing that Nigerian spammers might have great IT skills that, if properly leveraged, could be really effective within the mainstream economy. And also alternative skills. So when Bianca's not being a protester, she's really looking at different soft skills that we're going to need that go against this whole command and control capitalism that we've been living in for the past couple centuries. And the next component is really thinking about the networks and relationships that are going to be critical to the misfit revolution. I think across all these misfits, what's so fantastic is to see the sort of entourages at work within these subcultures, that you have these networks that aren't just within the nuclear unit of the family, or aren't these weak ties in LinkedIn and Facebook, but you have these incredibly supportive entourages that make anything any quirk you have they normalize it. And these kinds of relationships allow for huge cultural innovations to happening. I think if you look at Hemingway, for example, and what he was able to do to change the genre of writing in the 1920s, he had a whole gaggle of misfits around him in Paris at the time that were critical to the development of that. And so in my own work, too, beginning to build out collectives of people that are key to getting this done. And then finding out the infrastructure piece. So after that collective is built, where do we go? What do we hang out in hacker spaces? Can we begin to build alternative governments? What is the financing that we can actually use to unlock some of these experiments? Because there's a real danger if we build a lot of these experiments on the old financial infrastructure that will be poisoned by that, and we'll experience a lot of mission drift because of this. So this is something that's really ongoing for me to figure out how the different pieces of the Misfit Revolution fit together. But I wanted to just ask you guys and take a moment to really turn to the person next to you and share with them the misfit. They can be on the stage or they can not be on the stage, that you're most inspired by and why. And maybe make a commitment to that person to explore that misfit a bit more. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all. We have some questions.
Yeah.
So, Alexa, what kind of misfit are you?
Well, so in the last year, I've been playing with this character called the Amish Futurist,
Right.
which is where I dress up in Amish clothes and I interview technologists in this Socratic kind of dialogue. So that's pretty misfit, I would say. And it's amazing because I don't get to be this thought leader. I can just be very like vulnerable.
Are you kind of hermit style then? Or?
A little hermity,
Yeah.
very confused, very innocent. It's totally shifted my field of attraction too. Like the men who come onto me when I'm in the Amish character are very different than usual.
Do you have other identities? Further identities?
Further identities. Yeah, I mean, this came up at our Prototyping the Self workshop. I think there's an aspect of me that a sort of Scottish-Greek combination that's super warrior-like.
Okay.
And yeah, doesn't quite understand the Anglo world very well.
Okay.
And yeah, what about you? What?
I was thinking about, probably Dragon Ball.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think that's my second identity.
I can see that. I can see that in you.
All right, then some people ask why most of the misfits in the video were colored people.
Okay, yeah. So the project, actually this video we made based on footage from our filmmaker who spent 2 years in South Africa doing research in the informal economy. So part of the reason for that is because we had great footage from South Africa so that we didn't have to steal other people's footage. But another part of it was that we were actually looking to tell stories about the informal economy. So we did a lot of work in slums in India and South Africa initially. And I think the statistic is by 2050, 2/3 of all people will be working in the informal economy. So that was a really important bent of the film piece.
I must say I was a bit skeptic first, having 9 people on stage, but I'm really glad we did it. Thanks,
Did it work?
Alexa.
Okay. Thank you very much. Woo-hoo.